Don't touch that. The words cut through the noise before Charlotte Hayes even realized the suitcase handle was already in her hand. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The rolling announcements overhead, the echo of hurried footsteps across polished floors, even the sharp, restless cries of her baby pressed against her shoulder. Then the world rushed back all at once. The airport buzzed with impatience. A man brushed past her with a muttered complaint. A woman nearby lifted her phone. The faint glow of recording already pointed in Charlotte's direction. Her fingers tightened instinctively around the worn handle of the suitcase. It looked like hers. Same faded navy shell. Same scuff along the corner. Same cheap luggage tag barely hanging by a thread. She had been chasing it for the past 30 seconds, heart pounding, terrified she would miss it, and with it, the last chance she had left. Her daughter stirred against her chest, small face flushed, breath warm and uneven. Charlotte adjusted the thin blanket, whispering softly, though her voice trembled. "It's all right, sweetheart. Mom's got you." But her voice didn't sound convincing, not even to herself. 10 minutes earlier, she had been running. Not walking, running. Through Terminal B, dodging travelers with polished carry-ons and confident strides, her own shoes worn thin against the tiles. The departure board had flickered once, then updated. Gate changed. Time shortened. Her pulse had jumped. Every second mattered now. She hadn't slept properly in 2 days. Her daughter's fever had spiked overnight, and the local clinic had told her plainly, she needed to get to Sydney, needed proper care, needed it soon. Charlotte didn't have much left. Not money, not options. Just this ticket she could barely afford and a suitcase filled with everything she owned that still mattered. Around her, the pressure built in quiet, suffocating ways. Eyes lingered too long. A man sighed loudly as she paused to adjust her grip. A staff member gestured impatiently toward the boarding area. "Ma'am, you'll need to keep moving. Keep moving." As if she hadn't been moving her entire life. As if standing still had ever been an option. She spotted the baggage carousel and felt a flicker of hope. Small, fragile, but enough. Her suitcase had to be there. It had to. She stepped forward, shifting her baby higher against her shoulder, ignoring the ache in her arms. The conveyor belt hummed steadily. One bag passed, then another. Her eyes darted, scanning, desperate. And then she saw it. The navy case. Same size. Same worn edges. Relief flooded her chest, so suddenly it almost made her dizzy. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the handle. And then, someone else's hand closed around her wrist. Firm. Unyielding. Not rough, but impossible to ignore. "Don't touch that." Charlotte turned sharply, her breath catching. The man standing beside her didn't look like he belonged in the chaos. Tall. Composed. Dark suit perfectly fitted, as though he had stepped out of a different world entirely. His expression was calm, but his eyes, steady, observant, were fixed on her with a quiet intensity that made her pulse spike. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Her mind raced, trying to understand what had just happened. This is mine," she said finally, her voice thinner than she intended. The baby shifted again, letting out a soft whimper. The man didn't release her wrist immediately, not until he was sure she had stopped pulling. Then he let go, slowly, deliberately. "No," he said, his tone even, controlled. "It isn't." The words landed harder than she expected. Around them, the atmosphere shifted. Subtle, but undeniable. People noticed. They always did. A security officer glanced over. The woman with the phone leaned in closer, curiosity sharpening her focus. Charlotte felt the heat rise to her cheeks. That familiar burn of being seen, not as a person, but as a problem, as suspicion, as something out of place. Her hands trembled slightly as she stepped back, clutching her baby closer. "It looks exactly the same," she murmured, more to herself than to him. The man's gaze flicked briefly to the suitcase, then back to her. Calculating, observing, not accusing, but not dismissing either. "That's why you shouldn't touch it," he replied quietly. There was no anger in his voice, no mockery, just certainty, and something else she couldn't quite place. Charlotte swallowed, her throat dry. The carousel kept moving. More identical bags circled past, each one blurring into the next. Her heart sank as doubt crept in. Had she made a mistake? Had exhaustion finally caught up with her? The baby's soft breathing grew uneven again, and Charlotte instinctively rocked her gently. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Not because she was sure she was wrong, but because it felt safer to apologize than to argue. It always had. The man studied her for a moment longer. Not her clothes. Not the worn edges of her suitcase or the tired lines beneath her eyes. He looked at her face. Really looked. And something in his expression shifted, subtle, but unmistakable. The noise of the airport pressed in around them again. Announcements echoed overhead. Footsteps hurried past. Life moved on, indifferent. But for Charlotte, everything had slowed to a fragile, uncertain pause. Because in that moment, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights with nothing but a sick child in her arms and a stranger's words echoing in her ears, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to think before. She wasn't just holding the wrong suitcase. She was standing at the edge of something she didn't understand yet. And somehow, impossibly, this man, this stranger who had stopped her, was part of it. Charlotte's apology seemed to dissolve into the air, unnoticed by everyone except the man standing in front of her. He did not respond immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted once more to the suitcase still circling on the carousel, then to the identical one that rolled into view just a few seconds later. This one had a faint tear near the zipper, barely visible unless someone knew where to look. Charlotte followed his line of sight, her breath catching as realization settled in like a slow, heavy weight. That one. That was hers. The handle was worn smoother. The tag slightly bent. Small details she would have recognized instantly if her mind had not been clouded by exhaustion and fear. She stepped forward carefully this time, hesitating just enough to confirm before reaching out again. Her fingers wrapped around the correct handle, and she pulled it toward her with a quiet exhale that trembled more than she wanted it to. "Thank you," she said softly, not quite meeting his eyes. The words felt insufficient, but they were all she had. The man gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging something unspoken rather than the simple mistake. Around them, the tension began to ease. The security officer lost interest. The woman with the phone lowered it, disappointment flickering across her face before she turned away. The moment that had threatened to spiral into something humiliating simply passed. But for Charlotte, it did not feel over. She adjusted the strap of her bag and shifted her daughter again, who stirred weakly against her chest. The baby's skin felt warmer now, and Charlotte's chest tightened with worry. She glanced toward the departure gates, calculating the time she had left. Not much. Every delay mattered. She turned to leave, pulling her suitcase behind her, but before she could take more than a step, the man spoke again. "She is not well." It was not a question. Charlotte paused, her grip tightening on the handle. For a moment, she considered brushing it off, offering a quick denial, continuing forward as if nothing else mattered. That was what she usually did. Keep moving. Do not explain. Do not invite attention. But something in his tone stopped her. Not intrusive. Not demanding. Just certain. She turned slightly, enough to face him without fully committing to the conversation. "She has a fever," Charlotte admitted quietly. The words felt heavier out loud. More real. The man's expression shifted again, subtle but clear. His gaze softened, though his posture remained composed. "How long?" he asked. "Since last night," she replied. "It got worse this morning." She swallowed, forcing herself to stay steady. "We have a flight to Sydney. I just need to get her there." The man nodded once, as if filing the information away with careful precision. His eyes moved briefly to the baby, taking in the flushed cheeks, the faint sheen of sweat, the way her small hand curled weakly against Charlotte's shoulder. When he looked back up, there was something different in his expression now. Not just observation. Decision. "What is her name?" he asked. Charlotte hesitated. It was a simple question, but it felt unexpectedly personal. Still, she answered. "Lily." The name seemed to linger for a moment between them. The man inclined his head slightly. "I am Ethan," he said. No title. No explanation. Just a name. It should not have meant anything. But there was a quiet confidence in the way he said it. As though the introduction carried weight, he did not feel the need to explain. Charlotte nodded politely, unsure what else to say. Her instinct was still to leave, to avoid prolonging the interaction. But before she could move again, Ethan glanced toward the departure screens overhead, then back at her boarding pass still clutched in her hand. "That flight is delayed," he said. The words hit her like a sudden drop. "What?" Charlotte turned quickly, her eyes scanning the screens. And there it was, updated just moments ago. A delay she had not seen while rushing through the terminal. Her heart sank. No, she whispered under her breath, more to herself than to him. The extra time should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like another obstacle. More waiting, more uncertainty, more minutes with her daughter's condition unchanged. She pressed her lips together, fighting the rising panic. It will not be long, Ethan added, his tone calm, measured, but long enough to matter. Charlotte let out a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. I will manage, she said quietly. It was the only response she knew how to give. Manage. Endure. Keep going. Ethan studied her for a moment, as if weighing something internally. Then his gaze shifted toward a nearby seating area, quieter, away from the main flow of traffic. Come, he said simply. Charlotte blinked, caught off guard. I am fine, she replied quickly, almost automatically. You are not, he said, not unkindly. Just honest. The words settled in a way that made it difficult to argue. For a brief moment, Charlotte considered refusing again. Pride flickered faintly, stubborn and familiar. But it was quickly overshadowed by the weight in her arms. The warmth of Lily's fever, the exhaustion that had been building for days without rest. Slowly, she nodded. Ethan did not wait for further confirmation. He turned and began walking toward the quieter area, confident she would follow. And after a heartbeat of hesitation, she did. The seats were tucked near a wide window overlooking the runway. Planes moved in the distance, steady and controlled, a contrast to the chaos inside the terminal. Charlotte lowered herself into the chair carefully, adjusting Lily in her arms. The baby stirred, letting out a faint, tired sound before settling again. Ethan remained standing for a moment, observing the scene with a quiet focus. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He typed something quickly, his movements efficient, practiced. Charlotte watched him, unsure what to expect. She had met strangers before. Some kind, some not. But there was something about Ethan that did not fit into any category she recognized. He did not seem rushed. He did not seem curious in the usual way. He simply acted. A moment later, he slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked at her again. Someone is coming, he said. Charlotte frowned slightly. For what? She asked. Ethan's answer was simple. To help. And for the first time since stepping into the airport, Charlotte felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Not relief. Not yet. But the quiet, fragile beginning of it. Charlotte did not ask who was coming. She did not ask how. She simply sat there, her body still, her mind racing in quiet circles she could not seem to escape. Lily shifted again in her arms, a soft, restless movement that made Charlotte tighten her hold instinctively. The warmth against her chest had not faded. If anything, it felt stronger now. She brushed a strand of pale blonde hair away from Lily's damp forehead and pressed her lips together, holding back the rising edge of fear that threatened to surface. Around them, the airport continued its steady rhythm. Announcements echoed overhead, calm and practiced. Boarding calls, final notices, delays explained in neutral tones that did nothing to ease the tension they created. People moved with purpose, dragging suitcases, checking phones, living lives that seemed so distant from the quiet moment Charlotte found herself in. Ethan remained standing nearby, his posture composed, his attention shifting between Charlotte and the surrounding space, as if he were aware of everything at once. He did not hover. He did not intrude. But he did not leave either. It was a presence Charlotte could not ignore, even when she tried to focus solely on Lily. Minutes passed. Or maybe it was longer. Time had begun to blur, stretching in strange ways that made it difficult to measure. Charlotte adjusted her position slightly, wincing as a dull ache settled into her shoulders. She had been carrying Lily for hours now, refusing to set her down, afraid the moment she did something might change, that the fragile balance she was holding together would break. You can rest her here, Ethan said quietly, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. Charlotte hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the chair. It was a simple suggestion, logical, sensible, but letting go, even for a moment, felt impossible. She will be all right, he added, his tone steady, offering reassurance without pressure. Slowly, carefully, Charlotte shifted Lily onto the seat beside her, keeping one hand gently against her small chest, as if to anchor her there. Lily stirred faintly, her breathing uneven but steady enough to allow Charlotte a small breath of relief. Charlotte flexed her fingers, easing the stiffness in her arms, though her gaze never left her daughter's face. Ethan watched the exchange in silence, his expression thoughtful. There was no impatience in him, no sign that he considered this moment an inconvenience. If anything, he seemed fully present in it. Then, footsteps approached. Not hurried, not chaotic, purposeful. Charlotte looked up instinctively, her heart lifting and tightening at the same time. A woman in a neat uniform approached them, her movements calm, her eyes kind but focused. She carried a small medical bag, the kind that suggested preparation rather than urgency. "Mr. Cole," the woman said with a slight nod of acknowledgement. Charlotte's attention shifted instantly to Ethan. Cole. The name settled into her mind with quiet weight. She had not asked for his surname. She had not needed to. But hearing it now, spoken with recognition, changed something. Ethan returned the nod, his expression unchanged. "Thank you for coming quickly," he said. The woman's gaze moved to Charlotte and Lily, assessing without judgment, her presence steady and reassuring. "Of course," she replied. "How long has she had the fever?" Charlotte felt her throat tighten as the question turned toward her. She straightened slightly, instinctively protective. "Since last night," she answered. "It got worse this morning." The woman knelt gently beside the chair, her movements careful and respectful. "I'm just going to check her, all right?" she said softly. Charlotte nodded, though her hand remained close to Lily, hovering as if ready to intervene at the slightest discomfort. The woman worked with quiet efficiency, placing a small thermometer, checking Lily's pulse, observing the subtle signs Charlotte had been too overwhelmed to fully process. There was no rush, no panic, just calm, practiced care. Ethan stepped slightly to the side, giving space, but his attention remained fixed on the scene. Charlotte watched every movement, her breath shallow, her thoughts suspended between hope and fear. After a moment, the woman looked up, her expression measured but reassuring. "Her temperature is elevated, but not dangerously so," she said. "She is dehydrated and tired. Has she been feeding well?" Charlotte shook her head slightly. "Not much today," she admitted. The woman nodded, as if expecting that answer. She reached into her bag and retrieved a small bottle and a soft cloth. "Let us try to cool her down gently," she said, "and we will get some fluids into her." Charlotte swallowed, relief beginning to edge into her chest, though she did not allow it to fully settle yet. It felt too early, too uncertain. Still, the presence of someone who knew what to do, who spoke with quiet confidence, shifted something inside her. She was no longer alone in this moment. Ethan watched Charlotte closely, noticing the subtle change in her posture, the slight easing of tension in her shoulders. It was not dramatic, not immediate, but it was there, a beginning. He stepped closer again, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "She will be all right," he said. This time, Charlotte did not dismiss the words. She did not deflect them or push them aside. She simply nodded, her eyes still on Lily, her hand gently brushing her daughter's cheek. And for the first time since stepping into the airport, since running through the terminal with fear pressing against every thought, Charlotte allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were not about to fall apart. Not yet. The cool cloth pressed gently against Lily's forehead, and Charlotte watched as a faint sigh escaped her daughter's lips, small but noticeable. It was the first sign of comfort she had seen in hours, and it loosened something tight in her chest that she had not realized she had been holding so firmly. The woman continued her work with quiet precision, her movements calm and measured, as if she had done this 1,000 times before. The soft rustle of medical supplies, the subtle shift of fabric, the low murmur of reassurance created a small pocket of stillness in the middle of the busy terminal. Charlotte leaned forward slightly, her hand never straying far from Lily's, her fingers brushing lightly against the baby's arm as if to remind herself that she was still there, still safe, still within reach. Ethan stood just a step away, his presence steady, his gaze occasionally drifting toward the passing crowd, but always returning to Charlotte and Lily. He did not interrupt. He did not offer unnecessary words. He simply remained, as if understanding that sometimes the most valuable thing a person could give was quiet certainty. The woman adjusted the cloth again and then offered a small bottle toward Charlotte. "Try a little at a time," she said gently. "Even a few sips will help." Charlotte nodded, her movements careful as she supported Lily's head and guided the bottle toward her lips. For a moment, there was hesitation. Then, slowly, Lily responded, taking a small amount before turning her face slightly away. It was not much, but it was enough to bring a fragile sense of progress. "Good girl," Charlotte whispered, her voice soft, her eyes bright with a mix of relief and lingering worry. The woman smiled faintly, then sat back on her heels. "She is responding well," she said. "The delay in your flight may actually work in your favor. It gives her time to settle before you travel." Charlotte exhaled slowly, absorbing the words. Just minutes ago, the delay had felt like another burden. Now, it carried a different weight. Not a solution, but an opportunity. She glanced briefly toward the departure screens again, then back to Lily, her priorities quietly shifting into place. "Thank you," Charlotte said, her voice steadier now. The woman gave a small nod, then rose gracefully, gathering her supplies with practiced efficiency. "I will stay nearby for a little while," she added. "Just in case." Charlotte nodded again, her gratitude evident even without further words. As the woman stepped away, the space felt different. Not empty, but calmer, more contained. Charlotte adjusted Lily gently, settling her more comfortably against the seat, her hand resting lightly over her daughter's small chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. It was still warm, still not right, but it was no longer spiraling out of control. Ethan moved slightly closer, his voice low. "You handled that well." Charlotte blinked, caught off guard by the comment. She glanced up at him, uncertainty flickering across her expression. "I just did what I had to," she replied quietly. Ethan regarded her for a moment, as if considering the simplicity of that answer. "Most people do not," he said. The statement lingered, not as praise, but as observation. Charlotte did not know how to respond to that. Compliments were unfamiliar. Acknowledgement even more so. She looked back at Lily instead, focusing on the familiar rhythm of care that grounded her. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The airport noise softened into the background, no longer overwhelming, but simply present. A distant announcement echoed. A child laughed somewhere nearby. Life continued, but it no longer pressed against Charlotte in the same suffocating way. Her shoulders eased slightly, the tension that had defined every movement since she arrived beginning to loosen. She became aware of small things again. The cool air near the window, the faint hum of planes outside, the weight of her own breath slowing, steadying. Ethan watched the change without drawing attention to it. He had seen it before, though rarely. The moment when someone moved from survival into something quieter, something steadier. It was not dramatic. It was not visible to most. But it was real. "You said you were going to Sydney," he said after a while. Charlotte nodded. "Yes." "For treatment?" he asked. She hesitated briefly, then answered. "The clinic there has better facilities. They told me it would be safer." Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the logic without questioning it. "You made the right decision," he said. Charlotte let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though it carried more exhaustion than humor. "I hope so," she murmured. Hope. The word felt fragile, uncertain, but it was there. For a moment, she allowed herself to sit in it, to feel it without immediately pushing it aside. Lily shifted again, but this time the movement was softer, less strained. Charlotte looked down quickly, her heart lifting at the subtle difference. The tension in her daughter's small body seemed to have eased, even if only slightly. It was enough. Enough to keep going. Enough to believe that the path ahead, uncertain as it was, might still lead somewhere better. Ethan noticed the change as well. He did not comment on it directly, but his posture relaxed almost imperceptibly. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket, but he ignored it for the moment, his attention still fixed on the scene before him. This was not where he had planned to be, not how his day was meant to unfold. But as he stood there, watching Charlotte gently adjust the blanket around Lily, he realized something with quiet clarity. Some moments did not belong to plans. They belonged to choices. And he had already made his. Charlotte, unaware of the full weight of that decision, simply continued what she had been doing all along. Caring, holding on, moving forward, one small step at a time. And for the first time since everything had begun to unravel, she no longer felt like she was doing it completely alone. The quiet between them settled into something steady, something almost unfamiliar to Charlotte, as if the world had paused just enough to let her breathe properly for the first time in days. Lily's small body rested against the seat, her breathing still warm but no longer as strained, and Charlotte found herself watching every rise and fall of her chest, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the moment. Her fingers moved instinctively, smoothing the blanket, adjusting it by the smallest fraction, as though control over these tiny details could keep everything else from slipping away again. Ethan remained nearby, his presence unchanged, but now Charlotte was more aware of it. Not as something intrusive, but as something steady, almost grounding. She glanced at him briefly, then looked away, unsure how to navigate the quiet space between gratitude and unfamiliar trust. People did not usually stay. They passed through, offered brief moments of kindness if they offered anything at all, and then disappeared back into their own lives. But he had not moved. Not yet. The woman who had helped with Lily lingered at a distance, speaking quietly into a radio, her eyes occasionally flicking back toward them in subtle reassurance. Charlotte noticed it, and the awareness brought a strange mix of comfort and disbelief. This level of care was not something she was used to receiving. It felt almost undeserved, even as she accepted it. A soft chime echoed from the overhead speakers, followed by an announcement about boarding updates. Charlotte instinctively looked up, her eyes scanning the screens again. The delay remained, but the time had shifted slightly. Closer now. Not immediate, but approaching. Her chest tightened, not with panic this time, but with calculation. She would need to be ready. She always did. "You should rest while you can," Ethan said quietly. Charlotte let out a faint breath, almost a tired smile, though it barely reached her eyes. "I do not think I remember how," she replied. The honesty slipped out before she could stop it. It lingered between them, simple and unguarded. Ethan studied her for a moment, not with pity, but with understanding that felt deeper than she expected. "You do not have to do everything at once," he said. Charlotte shook her head slightly, her gaze returning to Lily. "That is not really how it works," she murmured. There was no bitterness in her tone, just truth, the kind that had been shaped over time, reinforced by every moment she had been forced to manage alone. Ethan did not argue. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging that her reality did not need to be corrected to be understood. Another silence followed, but it was different now. Less tense, more reflective. Charlotte shifted slightly in her seat, her muscles still aching but no longer overwhelmed by the strain. She let her hand rest more lightly on Lily's chest, trusting the steady rhythm she felt beneath her fingertips. It was a small act of letting go. Not complete, but enough to matter. "What do you do?" The question came quietly, almost hesitant, as if Charlotte was unsure whether she should ask at all. Ethan looked at her, the faintest hint of surprise crossing his expression before it settled back into calm. "I run a company," he said. The answer was simple, almost understated. Charlotte nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something she had already suspected. His composure, his presence, the way people responded to him without words. It all made sense now, though she did not press for details. It did not feel necessary. "That explains it," she said softly. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "Explains what?" Charlotte hesitated, then allowed herself a small, tired smile. "You do not seem like someone who waits around airports for no reason." The corner of Ethan's mouth shifted almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, but something close. "Neither do you," he replied. The words caught her off guard, and for a moment, she did not know how to respond. Because he was right. She was not supposed to be here like this. Not like this. Not with everything hanging so uncertainly in front of her. Her gaze dropped back to Lily, and the faint smile faded into something quieter. "I did not have much of a choice," she said. Ethan watched her carefully, noting the shift in her tone, the weight behind the words. "Sometimes choices are not about options," he said. "They are about priorities." Charlotte absorbed that in silence, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the blanket. It was a perspective she understood instinctively, even if she had never put it into words. Lily stirred again, but this time her movement was softer, her breathing more even. Charlotte leaned closer, her heart lifting at the subtle improvement. She brushed her lips lightly against Lily's forehead, her eyes closing for just a second as relief washed through her in a quiet wave. When she looked up again, Ethan was still there, still watching, but now there was something else in his expression. Not just observation, not just decision, something more personal. As if this moment, this small, fragile shift mattered to him in a way that went beyond simple circumstance. Charlotte felt it, even if she could not fully understand it. And for the first time, she did not look away. Outside the window, a plane began to taxi slowly across the runway, its movement steady and deliberate. Inside, the world continued its rhythm. But for Charlotte, everything had narrowed down to this small space, this quiet exchange, this unexpected pause in the middle of everything that had been falling apart. And as she sat there, her hand resting lightly over her daughter's steady breathing, she realized something that felt both strange and undeniable. Sometimes, the moment that changes everything does not arrive with noise or urgency. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, with someone who simply chooses to stay. The announcement came softer this time, but Charlotte heard it instantly, her attention snapping upward before the words had even fully formed. Boarding would begin soon. Not immediately, but soon enough that the fragile calm she had found began to shift again, tightening slightly around the edges. Her fingers curled gently against the fabric of Lily's blanket, instinctively anchoring herself to the one thing that mattered most. Lily's breathing had steadied further, the heat of her fever still present, but no longer, rising in waves that made Charlotte's chest tighten with every second. It was a small improvement, but it changed everything. It gave her something to hold on to. Ethan noticed the shift before she spoke, the way her posture adjusted, the subtle return of tension behind her eyes. "You were thinking about the flight?" he said quietly. Charlotte nodded, her gaze still fixed on Lily. "I have to be ready," she replied. "If I miss it," she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The weight of it lingered in the silence that followed. Ethan understood. Not the specifics, perhaps, but the urgency. The kind that did not allow for mistakes. The kind that turned every decision into something final. "You will not miss it," he said, his tone steady, not offering comfort, but certainty. Charlotte looked up at him then, really looked, as if trying to understand how he could say something like that so simply. There was no hesitation in him. No doubt. It unsettled her in a way she could not quite explain, because certainty like that was not something she had known for a long time. Before she could respond, the woman in uniform returned, her steps measured, her expression calm. "She is stabilizing," she said, glancing at Lily with a reassuring nod. "Her temperature is coming down slowly. It is safe for her to travel, but you will need to keep her comfortable." Charlotte exhaled, a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Safe." The words settled into her chest with quiet weight. Not perfect, not guaranteed, but safe enough to move forward. "Thank you," she said again, her voice softer now, steadier. The woman smiled faintly, then turned slightly toward Ethan. "Everything is arranged," she said. Charlotte's attention snapped back, confusion flickering across her expression. "Arranged," she echoed. Ethan met her gaze, calm as ever. "You will not be boarding with the main group," he said. Charlotte blinked, the words not immediately making sense. "What do you mean?" she asked. Her grip tightened slightly on the edge of the seat, instinctively cautious. Ethan did not rush his explanation. "There is a quieter boarding process available," he said. "Less crowded. Less pressure. It will be easier for her." He nodded slightly toward Lily. Charlotte stared at him, the pieces slowly beginning to come together. "That is not for people like me," she said quietly. It was not bitterness, just fact. She had spent enough time navigating systems to know where she fit within them, and where she did not. Ethan's expression did not change. "Today, it is," he replied. The simplicity of the statement left no room for argument, but Charlotte still felt it rising inside her. Not rejection. Not exactly. Something closer to disbelief. "I cannot pay for that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's gaze softened slightly, though his posture remained steady. "You are not paying for it," he said. Charlotte shook her head immediately, the reaction instinctive. "No," she said, more firmly this time. "I cannot accept that." The words came quickly, driven by something deeper than pride. Something shaped by years of learning that nothing came without a cost. That help always carried weight. That accepting too much could leave you owing more than you could ever return. Ethan watched her carefully, recognizing the resistance not as refusal, but as protection. "You are not accepting anything," he said calmly. "You are doing what is best for her." His gaze shifted briefly to Lily, then back to Charlotte. "That is all that matters." Charlotte felt the words settle into her. challenging something she had held onto for a long time. The idea that she had to carry everything alone, that needing help meant weakness, that accepting it meant losing something in return. She looked down at Lily again, her small face more relaxed now, her breathing steady beneath the soft rise and fall of the blanket. Everything else faded for a moment. The noise, the movement, the uncertainty. It all narrowed down to this single, simple truth. What was best for her child? Charlotte swallowed, her throat tight, her thoughts shifting in quiet, careful steps. "There are no conditions?" she asked finally, her voice hesitant, searching. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "None," he said. "No elaboration. No explanation. Just a single word, steady and clear." Charlotte held his gaze for a moment longer, as if trying to find something hidden beneath it. Some sign of expectation. Some indication that this would come back to her later. But there was nothing. Just calm certainty. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she nodded. "All right," she said softly. The word felt unfamiliar, like stepping into something unknown without fully understanding where it would lead. Ethan inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the decision without making it larger than it needed to be. "We will move when they call your row," he said. Charlotte adjusted Lily gently, lifting her back into her arms, her movements careful but more confident now. The weight was still there, the responsibility, the uncertainty of what came next, but it no longer felt like it was pressing down on her from every side. Outside the window, another plane lifted into the sky, rising steadily, disappearing into the soft stretch of clouds beyond. Charlotte watched it for a moment, her thoughts quiet, her breath steady. Then she looked back at Lily, her hand resting lightly against her back, feeling the warmth, the life, the small but steady strength that had carried them this far. And for the first time since everything had begun, she allowed herself to believe that maybe they were not just surviving anymore. Maybe they were finally moving toward something better. The boarding call came sooner than Charlotte expected. The calm voice over the speakers announcing rose in a steady rhythm that seemed almost too normal for what she was feeling inside. Her heart responded instantly, a quiet surge of urgency rising beneath the fragile calm she had managed to build. She adjusted Lily carefully in her arms, lifting her just enough to settle her weight more securely against her shoulder. Lily stirred slightly but did not cry, her small body still warm but no longer radiating that sharp, alarming heat that had terrified Charlotte only an hour earlier. It was enough to move forward. It had to be. Around them, passengers began to gather, forming loose lines that slowly tightened as the process began. Bags rolled, shoes tapped softly against the polished floor, voices blended into a low murmur of anticipation. Charlotte watched it all with a distant awareness, her focus narrowing instinctively to what mattered most. The path ahead. The next step. Ethan stepped closer, his presence steady as ever, but now there was a subtle shift in his posture. Not urgency, not pressure, just readiness. "Stay with me," he said quietly. Charlotte nodded without hesitation this time. There was no resistance left in that decision. Not because everything suddenly felt easy, but because she had already crossed the line where doing this alone no longer made sense. Together, they moved. Not toward the main line where the crowd pressed forward in small, impatient waves, but toward a side entrance Charlotte had barely noticed before. It was quieter there. Less movement. Less noise. A staff member stood nearby, her posture attentive, her eyes immediately recognizing Ethan before flicking briefly to Charlotte and Lily. There was no question, no hesitation, just a small, respectful nod as she stepped aside and opened the way forward. Charlotte felt it again, that strange shift in reality she had not quite adjusted to. Doors opening without explanation. Space being made where there had been none. It was disorienting, but she did not stop. Could not. Ethan guided the pace without touching her, his presence enough to signal direction. The corridor beyond was calmer, the noise of the main terminal fading into a distant hum. The air felt cooler, the lighting softer. Charlotte's breathing steadied instinctively, matching the slower rhythm of the space around her. Lily remained quiet, her head resting against Charlotte's shoulder, her small breaths warm but even. Every few seconds, Charlotte's hand moved gently across her back, a silent reassurance she needed as much as Lily did. They reached the gate quickly, bypassing the line entirely. Another staff member greeted them, her expression composed but attentive, her focus immediately drawn to Lily. "We will board you first," she said gently. Charlotte nodded. Her voice caught somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. "Thank you," she managed. The words felt small compared to everything that had shifted in the past hour, but they were all she had. Ethan remained beside her, his attention moving between Charlotte, Lily, and the surrounding staff, ensuring everything continued without disruption. There was no display of authority, no raised voice, just quiet control that seemed to shape the environment around him without effort. As they stepped closer to the aircraft door, Charlotte felt a brief flicker of hesitation. It was not doubt about the journey. Not anymore. It was something else. The awareness that this moment, this unexpected stretch of support, might not extend beyond this point. That once she stepped onto the plane, things would return to what they had been. Uncertain, fragile, entirely hers to manage again. She paused for just a fraction of a second, her grip tightening slightly on Lily. Ethan noticed immediately. "You are ready," he said, his voice low but steady. Charlotte looked at him then, her eyes searching his face as if trying to hold on to something she could not quite define. "I do not know how to thank you," she said quietly. The words carried more weight than their simplicity suggested. Ethan held her gaze, his expression calm, almost thoughtful. "You do not need to," he replied. Charlotte shook her head slightly, emotion flickering beneath the surface. "I do," she insisted, though her voice remained soft. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly to Lily, then back to Charlotte. "Then take care of her," he said. "That is enough." The simplicity of the answer settled into her more deeply than anything else he had said. No conditions, no expectations, just a single, clear priority. Charlotte nodded slowly, her throat tight, her grip on Lily softening just enough to allow a gentle adjustment. "I will," she said. The promise was not just to him. It was to herself, to everything she had fought through to reach this point. A staff member gestured gently toward the aircraft door, the signal that it was time. Charlotte took a breath, steadying herself, and stepped forward. The transition was quiet. No crowd, no pressure, just a smooth movement from one space into another. As she crossed the threshold, she felt something shift again, not in the world around her, but within herself. The fear that had driven every step was still there, but it no longer controlled her in the same way. It had been tempered by something unexpected. Support, kindness, a moment of being seen and helped without judgment. She turned once more before fully stepping inside, her eyes finding Ethan where he stood just outside the boarding area. He had not moved, had not turned away. For a brief moment, everything else faded again. The noise, the movement, the uncertainty. It all narrowed down to that single, quiet exchange of understanding. Charlotte gave a small nod, her expression carrying more than words could hold. Ethan returned it, just as simply. No smile, no gesture, just acknowledgement. Then Charlotte stepped forward, disappearing into the aircraft, carrying Lily close, carrying everything that had led her here, and something new as well. Something she had not expected to find. The knowledge that even in the most uncertain moments, there were still people who chose to stay long enough to change the direction of everything that came next. The cabin air felt different the moment Charlotte stepped inside, cooler and quieter, the steady hum of the aircraft replacing the layered noise of the terminal behind her. It was not silent, but it was contained, controlled, as if everything within these walls followed a rhythm she could finally understand. A flight attendant greeted her with a soft smile, her eyes immediately drawn to Lily, her tone lowering instinctively as she guided Charlotte toward a seat near the front where there was more space, more ease. Charlotte moved carefully, her steps measured, every movement centered around keeping Lily undisturbed. The seat felt softer than she expected as she lowered herself into it, adjusting Lily gently against her chest before fastening the belt with steady hands that still carried the faint tremor of everything she had just moved through. Lily stirred slightly, her small face pressing into Charlotte's shoulder, her breathing warm but calm, and for a moment Charlotte simply sat there, letting the reality of it settle. They had made it onto the plane. That alone felt like something she had not fully believed would happen. The attendant leaned in slightly, her voice soft and reassuring. "If you need anything, just let me know," she said, her gaze warm but unobtrusive. Charlotte nodded, her voice quiet but sincere. "Thank you." The words came easier now, no longer weighed down by disbelief, but still carrying a depth that went beyond simple politeness. As the attendant stepped away, Charlotte adjusted Lily once more, her fingers brushing lightly against her daughter's cheek, noting the subtle difference again. The heat had eased further. Not gone, but softer. Manageable. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering as the tension that had held her rigid for so long began to release in quiet, careful layers. Around her, the cabin began to fill, though not in the overwhelming way she had braced for. Passengers moved calmly, placing bags, settling into seats, voices low and measured. It was a different world from the one she had just left behind. A few rows back, someone laughed softly. A child asked a quiet question. Life continued, but here, it did not press against her. It simply existed alongside her. Charlotte let her head rest back for just a moment, her eyes closing briefly as she allowed herself a single breath of stillness. Not sleep. Not yet. Just a pause. When she opened her eyes again, her gaze drifted toward the window. The runway stretched out beyond the glass, wide and open, a path leading somewhere she had chosen without knowing exactly what waited at the end. She tightened her hold on Lily slightly, grounding herself in the present. This was what mattered. Not the uncertainty ahead, not the questions she could not answer. Just this moment. This small, steady progress forward. The cabin door remained open a little longer, and Charlotte found herself glancing toward it without fully meaning to. A quiet part of her wondered if she would see him again. Not because she expected it, but because something about the way he had stayed, the way he had stepped into her world without hesitation and then stepped back just as simply, had left an impression she could not ignore. But the doorway remained unchanged, staff moving in and out with practiced ease. No sign of the man who had altered the course of her day so completely. Charlotte looked away, a small, almost imperceptible shift in her expression, something between acceptance and quiet reflection. She had not asked for anything beyond this moment, and she had been given more than enough. The safety of this seat, the chance to move forward, the knowledge that Lily was stable, that they could continue. That was what mattered. A soft chime signaled the final stages of boarding, and the cabin began to settle into a quieter rhythm. The overhead lights dimmed slightly, the atmosphere shifting once more, this time toward departure. Charlotte adjusted the blanket around Lily, tucking it gently around her shoulders, her movements slower now, more deliberate. She checked Lily's breathing again, her hand resting lightly against her back, feeling the steady rise and fall. Still warm. Still there. Still enough. The plane began to move, a subtle shift at first, then a slow, steady roll forward. Charlotte felt it through the seat, through her body, through the quiet awareness that they were no longer waiting. They were moving. She looked out the window again, watching as the terminal slipped further away, the space between where they had been and where they were going widening with every second. The engines grew louder, not harsh, but powerful, a steady build that filled the cabin with a sense of momentum. Charlotte's grip on Lily tightened just slightly, not out of fear, but out of instinct. The moment mattered. The transition mattered. Then the plane lifted. Smooth. Certain. The ground falling away beneath them, replaced by open sky. Charlotte exhaled, a breath she had not realized she was holding, her body relaxing into the movement rather than resisting it. She looked down at Lily, her expression softening in a way it had not all day. "We are all right," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. It was not a declaration, not a certainty, but it was enough. Enough to carry them forward. And as the city below grew smaller, fading into the distance, Charlotte allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that this was not just an escape from what had been. It was the beginning of something she had not dared to imagine yet. Something steadier, something kinder, something that had started with a single moment, a single voice, and the simple decision of someone who had chosen not to look away. The steady hum of the aircraft settled into a quiet rhythm, one that seemed to wrap around Charlotte like a gentle reassurance rather than a pressure. The climb had smoothed out, the slight tilt easing into a level path that stretched endlessly ahead. Outside the window, the sky opened wide, pale blue fading into soft streaks of cloud that looked almost unreal from this distance. Charlotte barely noticed it at first. Her attention remained fixed on Lily, as it had been for hours, her senses tuned to every subtle shift in her daughter's breathing, every small movement that might signal change. But there was a difference now. Lily's breaths were slower, deeper. The tension that had held her tiny body so rigid earlier had softened, replaced by a fragile calm that Charlotte had been waiting for without even knowing if it would come. Charlotte let her fingers rest lightly against Lily's back, feeling that steady rhythm again, letting it anchor her thoughts. It was still warm, but no longer alarming. Manageable. The word returned to her mind, quiet but steady. She adjusted the blanket slightly, careful not to disturb the sleep that had finally taken hold. Around her, the cabin had settled into a gentle stillness. A few passengers leaned back in their seats, eyes closed. Others scrolled quietly through their phones, the glow of screens dim against the softened lighting. The flight attendants moved with quiet efficiency, their footsteps light, their voices low. It felt like a different world entirely from the one she had left behind just a short time ago. Charlotte shifted slightly in her seat, easing the stiffness in her shoulders, though she remained careful not to move too much. The exhaustion she had been holding at bay began to creep in again, not as something overwhelming, but as a slow, steady weight that reminded her just how much she had carried to reach this point. She leaned her head back gently, her eyes closing for a brief moment. Not sleep. Not yet. Just rest. Her thoughts drifted, unstructured, moving through fragments of the past few hours. The rush through the terminal. The fear that had gripped her so tightly she could barely breathe. The moment at the baggage carousel that could have turned into something else entirely. And then him. Ethan. The name surfaced quietly, bringing with it a mix of clarity and confusion she had not fully processed. He had appeared without warning, intervened without explanation, and stayed without expectation. People did not do that. Not in her experience. Kindness, when it came, was usually brief. Conditional. Tied to something visible, something understandable. But this had been different. There had been no questions about her situation beyond what was necessary. No judgment. No demand for explanation. Just action. Just presence. Charlotte opened her eyes again, her gaze drifting toward the aisle as if she half expected to see him there, even though she knew he had not boarded. The space remained unchanged, passengers settled, attendants moving quietly. No sign of the man who had altered the direction of her day so completely. She let out a small breath, something between acceptance and quiet reflection. Not everything needed to be understood immediately. Some moments simply existed, complete in themselves. Lily shifted slightly, a small movement that drew Charlotte's attention instantly back to her. Her hand moved automatically, smoothing the blanket, adjusting her position just enough to keep her comfortable. Lily's eyes fluttered faintly but did not open, her breathing steady, her small fingers curling gently against the fabric of Charlotte's shirt. Charlotte felt a warmth rise in her chest that had nothing to do with fear this time. Relief. Quiet and steady. She reached into her bag carefully with one hand, retrieving a small bottle and checking it with practiced movements. Everything she had was limited, measured, planned down to the smallest detail. But for now, it was enough. She guided the bottle gently toward Lily's lips, watching as she responded faintly, taking just a small amount before settling again. It was progress. Slow, fragile, but real. Charlotte leaned back. Again, her body finally allowing a fraction more weight to rest against the seat. The constant tension that had driven her forward for so long began to loosen, not completely, but enough to change the way she breathed, the way she held herself. She became aware again of the space around her, of the quiet hum of the engines, of the distant murmur of voices blending into a soft background that no longer demanded her attention. Time passed differently here. Slower, more measured, without the sharp edges of urgency that had defined every moment before. Charlotte let her gaze drift once more to the window. The clouds stretched endlessly, soft and distant, the world below hidden from view. It felt like being suspended between two places, not fully where she had been, not yet where she was going. A space in between. And for the first time, that space did not feel uncertain. It felt possible. She looked down at Lily again, her expression softening further. "We are getting there," she whispered, her voice barely audible, carried more by feeling than sound. It was not just about the destination anymore. Not just about reaching Sydney, reaching the clinic, reaching whatever came next. It was about this moment This quiet stretch of time where everything had slowed just enough for her to catch her breath. And as the aircraft continued its steady path through the sky, Charlotte realized something that settled into her with quiet certainty. The hardest part had not been the journey itself. It had been believing that she could make it through. And now, sitting here with her daughter safe in her arms, moving forward one steady mile at a time, she finally allowed herself to believe that she could. Time moved quietly inside the cabin, not marked by urgency but by small, steady changes that Charlotte could finally notice without fear pressing against every second. The hum of the engines remained constant, a low, reassuring sound that seemed to hold everything in place. And for the first time since the day had begun, Charlotte allowed herself to lean back just a little further into the seat, her body responding to the subtle permission to rest. Lily remained nestled against her, her small frame lighter now, not in weight but in tension, the stiffness that had worried Charlotte easing into something softer, something closer to peace. Charlotte watched her closely, as she always did, but her gaze had changed. It was no longer sharp with panic. It was gentle, observant, trusting in a way that felt unfamiliar but welcome. A flight attendant approached quietly, her steps careful, her voice low so as not to disturb the calm that had settled around them. She offered a small cup of water and a reassuring smile, pausing just long enough to ensure Charlotte was comfortable before moving on. Charlotte accepted with a soft thank you, her voice steady, her movements deliberate as she placed the cup within easy reach. Even small gestures like this felt different now. They no longer felt like interruptions. They felt like support. Charlotte shifted slightly, adjusting Lily so that her head rested more securely against her shoulder, her fingers brushing lightly through the soft strands of her daughter's hair. The warmth was still there, but it had changed, no longer alarming, no longer unpredictable. It was the kind of warmth that could be managed, that could be guided towards something better. She reached again for the small bottle, offering Lily a little more, watching as she responded faintly, taking just enough before settling again. It was slow progress, but it was steady, and that was enough. Charlotte's thoughts drifted again, not in scattered fragments this time, but in something more reflective, more grounded. The urgency that had defined her movements earlier had faded into the background, replaced by a quiet awareness of everything that had shifted. She thought about the moment at the airport, the way everything had felt on the verge of collapsing, and how quickly it had changed. Not through anything she had planned, not through anything she had expected, but through a single interruption, a single voice, a single decision made by someone who had no reason to step in, and yet had. Ethan's presence lingered in her mind, not as a question, but as something more settled. She did not need to understand why he had helped. She only needed to acknowledge that he had, and that it had mattered. She glanced once more toward the aisle, not searching this time, just acknowledging the space where he was no longer present. It felt different now, not empty, just complete. Some moments did not require continuation. They simply needed to exist long enough to change something. Lily shifted again, a small sound escaping her lips, softer than before, almost like a sigh. Charlotte responded immediately, her hand moving instinctively, her voice a quiet whisper meant only for her daughter. "It is all right. I am here." The words came naturally, without the edge of fear that had sharpened them earlier. They were steady now, certain. The plane moved through a gentle patch of turbulence, a slight tremor that rippled through the cabin. Charlotte felt it immediately, her body tensing for a fraction of a second before she consciously relaxed, her focus returning to Lily. The movement passed quickly, leaving the steady hum behind once more. It reminded her of something she had not allowed herself to think about before. Not everything that felt uncertain meant something was wrong. Sometimes it was just movement, just change, just part of the journey. She let that thought settle, her breathing matching the rhythm of the aircraft once again. Around her, the cabin remained calm. Passengers settled into their own quiet routines, the shared space held together by the unspoken understanding that for now, everyone was simply moving forward together. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, not fully, just enough to let her mind rest without losing awareness of Lily's presence. The exhaustion was still there, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It felt earned. It felt like something she could carry without it breaking her. When she opened her eyes again, the light outside the window had shifted slightly, the sky deepening in color as they continued their path. It was subtle, but it marked time in a way that felt steady rather than urgent. Charlotte watched it for a moment, then looked back down at Lily, her expression softening once more. "We are closer," she whispered, not needing to measure the distance in kilometers or minutes. She could feel it, not just in the movement of the plane, but in the shift within herself. The fear that had once defined every step had given way to something quieter. Not complete peace. Not yet, but something that held the promise of it. And as the aircraft continued its steady course through the open sky, Charlotte realized that the journey ahead no longer felt like something she had to survive. It felt like something she might actually be able to reach. The soft chimes signaling the next phase of the flight barely registered at first, blending into the quiet rhythm that had settled throughout the cabin. But Charlotte noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere almost immediately. The way the flight attendants began to move with slightly more purpose. The way the overhead lights adjusted just enough to suggest that something was changing, something approaching. She straightened slightly in her seat, her hand instinctively returning to Lily's back, feeling the steady rise and fall that had become her constant reassurance. The warmth was still there, but it no longer carried the same weight of fear. It was something she could understand now, something she could respond to without panic. Lily stirred gently, her small fingers flexing against Charlotte's shirt, and Charlotte responded without hesitation, her voice low and soothing, her movements slow and careful. "It is all right, sweetheart. Just rest." The words came easily now, not forced, not strained, but natural, grounded in a quiet confidence that had grown steadily over the past hours. Around them, the cabin remained calm, passengers shifting slightly in their seats, some waking from light sleep, others glancing out the windows as the sky beyond began to change in subtle ways, the pale blue deepening, the clouds thinning as the aircraft moved closer to its destination. Charlotte followed one such glance, her eyes drifting to the window beside her. The view had shifted again. The endless stretch of clouds was giving way to glimpses of land far below, faint outlines at first, then clearer shapes forming as the plane descended gradually. It was real now. They were getting closer, not just in distance, but in purpose. The thought settled into her chest with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch for a moment. Sydney, the clinic, the next step. It was no longer something distant or uncertain. It was approaching. Lily shifted again, her eyes fluttering open briefly, unfocused but aware enough to seek comfort. Charlotte responded instantly, adjusting her hold, bringing her closer, her fingers brushing gently across her cheek. "I am here," she whispered, her voice steady, her presence unwavering. Lily's eyes closed again, her body relaxing once more into the familiar rhythm of Charlotte's heartbeat. Charlotte let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing as she felt that connection settle once more. It grounded her in a way nothing else could. The flight attendant returned, her movements as quiet as before, her presence calm and reassuring. She leaned in slightly, her voice soft. "We will be landing in about 20 minutes, she said. Charlotte nodded, the information settling into her mind with a mix of readiness and quiet tension. 20 minutes. Not long. Not enough time to prepare for everything that would come next, but enough to begin shifting her focus forward again. "If you need assistance when we arrive, please let me know," the attendant added gently. Charlotte met her gaze and nodded again. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying the same steady sincerity it had earlier. As the attendant moved on, Charlotte adjusted Lily once more, checking the blanket, ensuring she was secure, comfortable, ready for the transition that was coming. The plane began its gradual descent, the change subtle at first, then more noticeable as the angle shifted, the engines adjusting their tone. Charlotte felt it through the seat, through her body, but this time it did not bring tension. It brought awareness, movement forward, progress. She glanced out the window again, watching as the ground below became clearer, the shapes more defined, the distance shrinking steadily. Roads, buildings, the faint glimmer of water catching the light. It was no longer abstract. It was real. They were arriving. Charlotte's thoughts shifted again, not backward this time, but forward. What would happen when they landed? The clinic, the process, the unknowns that still waited for her. The uncertainty was still there, but it no longer felt overwhelming. It felt manageable. She had made it this far. She would keep going. Lily stirred again, a small sound escaping her lips, softer than before, more like a breath than a cry. Charlotte responded immediately, her hand moving in a gentle, familiar pattern along her back. "We are almost there," she whispered, her voice carrying a quiet reassurance that she was beginning to believe herself. The plane descended further, the city rising to meet them, the details sharpening with every passing second. Charlotte felt her heartbeat steady, matching the rhythm of the descent, her focus narrowing once more to the simple, clear task ahead. Get through the landing. Get Lily to the clinic. Keep moving forward. Everything else could wait. She adjusted her posture slightly, preparing for the final moments of the flight, her body responding automatically to the subtle cues she had learned over time. Her hand remained on Lily, constant, steady, unchanging. The cabin grew quieter, the collective awareness of arrival settling over the passengers, each person shifting into their own private thoughts about what waited beyond the aircraft doors. For Charlotte, there was no distraction, no wandering thought, just clarity, just purpose. The wheels touched down with a gentle, controlled impact, the sound soft but definitive, a transition from air to ground that carried more meaning than she could fully put into words. Charlotte felt it through her entire body, a quiet confirmation that they had arrived, that they had made it. She closed her eyes for just a second, her breath steady, her hand still resting against Lily's back. When she opened them again, the world had shifted once more. They were no longer in between. They were here. And whatever came next, she was ready to face it. The aircraft slowed gradually as it moved along the runway, the steady hum of the engines shifting into a softer, controlled rhythm that signaled the end of the journey through the air and the beginning of something grounded, something immediate. Charlotte remained still in her seat for a moment, her hand resting gently against Lily's back, feeling the small, steady movements that had carried them safely through the flight. The cabin lights brightened slightly, and the quiet murmur of passengers returning to awareness filled the space around her, seatbelts clicking open, bags shifting, voices rising just enough to mark the transition. But Charlotte did not rush. She had learned, in the past hours, that not every moment needed to be chased. Some needed to be held, just long enough to settle. Lily stirred faintly, her eyes opening for a brief second before closing again, her body still leaning into the comfort of Charlotte's arms. Charlotte brushed her fingers lightly across her cheek, noting again the subtle change. The warmth was still there, but softer, manageable. The word returned once more, stronger this time, no longer uncertain. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders easing as she allowed herself to accept that they had made it this far, that the next step was no longer a distant goal, but something directly in front of her. The seatbelt sign dimmed, and passengers began to stand, the aisle filling gradually with movement. Charlotte remained seated, her focus still centered on Lily, her movements deliberate as she gathered her small bag, checking its contents quickly with practiced efficiency. Everything she needed was there. Everything she had managed to hold together through sheer determination and careful planning. A flight attendant approached once more, her presence as calm as before, her voice low and reassuring. "We will assist you when you are ready," she said gently. Charlotte nodded, her gratitude clear even in the quietness of her response. "Thank you." The attendant offered a small, understanding smile and stepped aside, creating space without pressure. Charlotte waited until the initial rush had eased, until the aisle no longer felt crowded or rushed. Then, slowly, she stood, adjusting Lily carefully against her shoulder, ensuring her head was supported, her blanket secure. The weight felt familiar now, no longer overwhelming, just part of what she carried. As she stepped into the aisle, the world seemed to shift once more, not in chaos, but in quiet transition. The movement was steady, controlled, guided. She followed the flow toward the exit, each step measured, her focus clear. The door of the aircraft stood open ahead, light from the terminal filtering in, marking the threshold between one phase of the journey and the next. As she stepped through, the air changed slightly, cooler, more grounded, carrying the subtle scent of the terminal beyond. A staff member waited just outside, her posture attentive, her eyes immediately softening as they settled on Lily. "This way," she said gently, guiding Charlotte toward a quieter path, away from the main stream of passengers. Charlotte followed without hesitation, her trust no longer something she questioned with every step. The corridor was calm, the noise of the main terminal distant, allowing Charlotte to move without pressure, without the constant sense of needing to keep up. Each step felt intentional, leading her closer to what she had come here for. At the end of the corridor, another figure waited, not in uniform this time, but professional in a different way, calm and composed, holding a small tablet, her attention focused but kind. "Charlotte Hayes?" she asked softly. Charlotte's breath caught for a fraction of a second, the sound of her own name in this unfamiliar place grounding and disorienting at the same time. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the flicker of emotion beneath it. The woman nodded gently. "We have been expecting you," she said. The words settled into Charlotte with quiet weight. "Expecting you. Not searching. Not questioning. Expecting." As if her arrival here was not uncertain, not precarious, but part of something already in motion. "We will take you directly to the clinic," the woman continued, her tone calm, reassuring. "Everything is prepared." Charlotte felt a shift inside her, something deeper than relief, something that touched the edge of disbelief but did not fully cross into it. She nodded slowly, her hand tightening just slightly around Lily, as if to anchor herself to the moment. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying more meaning than she could fully express. The woman smiled faintly and gestured forward, leading the way with quiet confidence. Charlotte followed, her steps steady, her focus clear. The path ahead no longer felt uncertain in the same way it had before. It was still unknown, still filled with questions she could not yet answer. But it was no longer something she faced alone or blindly. As they moved through the quiet corridor toward the exit, Charlotte allowed herself one final thought about everything that had brought her here. The rush, the fear, the moment that had nearly unraveled everything, and the unexpected interruption that had changed its course. She did not know where Ethan was now. She did not know if their paths would cross again. But she knew this. The moment he had stepped in had not ended at the airport. It had carried forward, shaping everything that followed. Charlotte adjusted Lily gently, her voice soft, steady, certain. "We are here," she whispered. And this time, the words did not carry uncertainty. They carried arrival. Not just at a place, but at a moment she had fought to reach, one careful step at a time. The car ride from the airport was quiet, but it was not empty. It carried a different kind of silence, one filled with quiet assurance rather than uncertainty. Charlotte sat in the back seat, Lily resting gently against her chest, the steady rhythm of her breathing continuing to ground every thought, every movement. The city passed by outside the window, lights reflecting softly against the glass, buildings rising and falling in a rhythm that felt distant yet real. Sydney was alive around her, but for Charlotte, everything had narrowed once more to what was directly in front of her. Lily, the clinic, the next step. The woman seated in the front spoke occasionally, her voice calm, offering simple explanations about their route, their arrival time, the preparations that had already been made. Charlotte listened, absorbing what she could, but she did not need every detail. What mattered was clear. They were being taken somewhere ready for them, somewhere prepared. The car slowed as it approached a quiet building set slightly apart from the main road, its exterior modern, but understated, lights glowing warmly behind large glass panels. It did not feel overwhelming. It felt calm, controlled. As the car came to a stop, the door was opened almost immediately. Another staff member waiting with the same composed attentiveness Charlotte had begun to recognize. No urgency, no rush, just readiness. Charlotte stepped out carefully, adjusting Lily in her arms, her body instinctively shifting to protect and support. The air was cooler here, carrying a faint scent of something clean, something steady. Inside, the clinic was quiet, not silent, but peaceful in a way that made Charlotte's shoulders lower slightly without her even realizing it. Soft lighting, minimal noise, people moving with purpose, but without pressure. They were led through a short corridor, each step bringing Charlotte deeper into a space that felt prepared, intentional, as if every detail had been considered long before she arrived. A nurse greeted them at the doorway of a private room, her expression warm but focused. "We will take care of her now," she said gently. Charlotte hesitated for a fraction of a second, her grip tightening instinctively around Lily. Letting go, even for care, was not something that came easily. But this was why she had come. This was what she had fought for. Slowly, carefully, she nodded, allowing the nurse to guide her forward. The transition was gentle. No sudden movements. No overwhelming instructions. Just a quiet exchange as Lily was placed onto a soft bed, the nurse's hands steady, practiced, reassuring. Charlotte remained close, her hand resting lightly against Lily's arm, maintaining that connection even as others stepped in to help. Monitors were checked. Temperature confirmed. Small, careful steps taken to ensure Lily's comfort, her stability. Charlotte watched everything, her eyes following each movement, her mind absorbing each detail. There was no panic in the room, no urgency that suggested something was wrong. Just calm, controlled care. And that changed everything. A doctor entered quietly, introducing himself with a gentle nod, his voice steady as he began to assess Lily's condition. He spoke clearly, explaining each step, each observation, not overwhelming Charlotte with information, but offering enough to keep her grounded in the process. "She is stable," he said after a few moments, his tone reassuring. "The fever is under control. We will monitor her closely, but you brought her in at the right time." The words settled into Charlotte with a quiet force that she had not fully prepared for. At the right time. Not too late. Not almost too late. Just right. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering as something inside her finally released. Not all of it. Not the exhaustion. Not the lingering uncertainty of what came next. But the sharp edge of fear that had driven her forward began to soften, replaced by something steadier. Relief. Real relief. She moved closer to the bed, her fingers brushing lightly against Lily's hand, feeling the warmth, the life, the steady presence that had carried them through everything. Lily stirred slightly, her eyes opening for a brief moment, clearer now, more focused. Charlotte smiled softly, her voice gentle, steady. "You are all right," she whispered. The nurse adjusted a blanket, the doctor made a final note, and the room settled into a quiet rhythm of monitoring and care. Charlotte remained there, standing close, her presence unwavering, her focus clear. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time no longer felt urgent. It moved in a way that allowed her to breathe, to think, to feel without being overwhelmed. Eventually, a chair was placed beside the bed, and Charlotte sat, her hand still resting against Lily, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been all day. She looked around the room briefly, taking in the calm, the quiet, the sense of control that surrounded her. This was where she needed to be. This was where they needed to be. And as she sat there, her thoughts returned once more to everything that had led her here. The moment at the airport, the voice that had stopped her, the decision that had changed everything. She did not know if she would ever see Ethan again. She did not know if their paths were meant to cross beyond that single moment. But she understood something now that she had not before. Some people enter